Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. Sometimes I think about how some people solve problems in a really systematic way, but then other people kind of jump all over the place with their ideas, and I was wondering if you've noticed that too.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a great observation, and it really leads right into what we're going to talk about today. So, these different approaches are often called like vertical and lateral thinking.
Oh yeah, Edward de Bono's work, right? I
Exactly.
got to be honest, I'm a little fuzzy on the exact definitions. Could you break it down for us?
Yeah, for sure. So, vertical thinking, you can think of that as a step-by-step process.
Hmm.
It's very analytical, sequential, and it really relies on facts and logic. Like if you're following a recipe or you're putting together a piece of furniture from IKEA, you have a clear path and you stick to it.
Makes sense.
But then lateral thinking, that's more about kind of exploring different possibilities. You're challenging your assumptions and even like making these connections that you didn't expect before. So it's more like if you're brainstorming a new invention or you're coming up with a totally new way to solve a problem.
So if I wanted to get a new kitchen table, the vertical thinker would just go to the store, pick one out, and put it together, while the lateral thinker might be like, well, maybe I should build my own, or maybe I should upcycle something, or maybe I don't even need a table after all. Maybe a breakfast bar is better.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we probably all lean towards one style naturally, but to really solve problems and make good decisions, we need both.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I guess it takes all kinds, right?
And what's really cool is that research suggests that these two different thinking styles might actually be using different parts of the brain.
Wow, so there's like a biological basis for this.
Yeah, it's really fascinating.
Yeah.
But where does street epistemology fit into all of this? I mean, we usually think about TESI as a way to explore beliefs, but how does it relate to these different thinking styles?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Well, the core stages of SE actually mirror those shifts between lateral and vertical thinking that we were just talking
Yeah.
about. So first you start by building rapport. You create that safe space for open conversation.
Hmm,
And this actually encourages lateral thinking because when people feel comfortable, they're more likely to share those outside the box thoughts.
that makes sense.
And then you move on to identifying a specific claim.
So you're like narrowing down the focus.
Exactly. And that's more similar to the vertical thinking approach, where you're trying to define a very specific problem that you want to tackle.
So even just in like setting up the SE dialogue, you're already encouraging this back and forth between the two thinking styles.
Right. And then it keeps going from there.
Okay.
So next, you gauge confidence, like using those scales to see how certain the person is in their belief.
Like on a scale of 0 to 100%.
Yeah, and that actually blends both lateral thinking, because you're considering all those different levels of conviction, but also vertical thinking, because you're asking the person to assess where they stand.
Right. So it's not just I believe this or I don't believe this. It's like there's a whole range of possibilities in between.
And then we get to exploring the reasons for the belief. And this step really encourages lateral thinking because you're asking the person to basically brainstorm all those reasons why they hold that belief. It's kind of like coming up with ideas in a brainstorming
I
session.
like that analogy.
And then finally, you get to evaluate the quality of those reasons.
So now it's getting more analytical.
Yeah, exactly. And that mirrors vertical thinking because you're systematically going through each reason and you're seeing if it makes sense logically and if there's evidence to back it up.
So it's like this constant dance between these two different ways of thinking.
That's a great way to put it. And a good example of this is how SE practitioners approach conversations about climate change skepticism.
Oh, yeah. That's a hot topic these days.
So instead of jumping right into the science, which would be a very vertical approach, they really focus on the person's thought process. So it's a much more lateral exploration.
So instead of like bombarding the person with facts and figures, a good SE practitioner would start by asking something like, what led you to question the scientific consensus on climate change?
Exactly. You want to understand their perspective first. And then throughout the conversation, they're constantly weaving between those lateral and vertical approaches.
Okay, so
Give me an example. So they might ask these open-ended questions like, can you give me some specific examples that led you to believe this?
right, so that encourages the person to explore their reasons and think about different perspectives.
Yeah. And then they might shift to a more focused question like, how did you decide if that source was reliable?
So now you're bringing in that vertical thinking to examine the claims and the reasoning behind them.
And this back and forth really allows you to understand the person's belief system and how they arrived at their conclusions, but in a way that's respectful and open.
It's amazing how much depth there is to this whole process, and we've only just scratched the surface.
Well, we're just getting started. There's a lot more to unpack, so stay tuned. Subscribe now, or the cows will unleash a Moonami.
Moonami.
I know, it's like
I don't even know what that would look like.
a tidal wave of cows. You know, like a stampede
I don't even
of
know.
cows coming right at you. You're not going to forget a Moonami. You know what's really interesting is that street epistemology has like a whole toolbox of techniques that can be used to guide both lateral and vertical thinking.
Ooh, now we're getting to the good stuff. Give us some examples.
Okay, so one really powerful technique that encourages lateral thinking is called alternative perspective generation. And it's basically asking, what would change your mind? You know, like getting the person to step outside their current viewpoint and really consider other possibilities.
That's a good one because it's like you're challenging them to question those beliefs that they've probably held for a long time. It's like saying, okay, let's just put your current assumptions aside for a second and see what else might be true.
Yeah, exactly. And another lateral technique is that confidence gradient mapping that we were talking about earlier, you know, using those scales to measure belief certainty.
Right, because it introduces more nuance. It's not just like, I believe this or I don't believe this. It's more like, I'm 70% sure about this or I'm only 20% confident in that.
Exactly. And then there's this other technique called epistemic mirroring, where you basically reflect back the person's reasoning, but in a really neutral way.
So it's like you're holding up a mirror to their own thought process
Mm.
and they can see it from a new perspective.
Yeah, sometimes that can be really surprising for people because they hear their own thoughts, but in a different way, and it can make them think about things differently.
Interesting. So those are some of the lateral techniques. Now, what about the vertical side?
Well, one vertical technique is justification sequence analysis, where you break down a belief into all of its little reasons.
So it's like you're creating this flow chart of their thinking.
Yeah.
You start with the initial claim, and then you map out all those reasons that support it.
Yeah, and then you can start to examine each link in that chain of reasoning. You ask questions like, is this reason actually valid, or does it really lead to the next one?
It brings like a whole new level of rigor to the conversation.
Right. And then there's evidence quality grading, where you're looking at the sources that the person is using to support their belief.
So if they say something like, well, I read it online, so it must be true, a good SE practitioner would kind of challenge them to think about the credibility of that source and, any potential biases.
Exactly. You want to encourage them to be more discerning about the information they're consuming.
Right, because not everything you read online is true. That's for sure.
And then there's this other interesting technique called cognitive cost-benefit assessment, where you explore the amount of time and effort that the person has invested in maintaining their belief.
That's interesting because sometimes we hold on to beliefs just because we've put so much energy into them, even if they're not really serving us anymore.
Exactly. It's like that sunk cost fallacy.
Okay, so we've talked about these different techniques for guiding lateral and vertical thinking. But how does this all connect to the bigger picture of how we form beliefs in the first place?
Well, one of the sources talks about this concept called the inference escalator, which basically describes how we build up these complex beliefs through a series of inferences.
It's like we're climbing a ladder, and each step is a new inference that's building on the one before it.
And what's cool is that street epistemology can actually be used to encourage both horizontal and vertical movement on this inference escalator.
So you can encourage horizontal movement by asking something like, could this experience also be explained by this other factor, which would encourage the person to make new connections between ideas?
Yeah, exactly. And then you could encourage vertical movement by asking, what evidence do you have to support that link? Or is there a more plausible explanation? So you're helping them to evaluate the strength of those connections.
It's like street epistemology helps us to both explore new possibilities and also to test the validity of those possibilities.
That's a great way to put it. And this actually brings us to the topic of cognitive dissonance, which is that feeling of discomfort that we get when we hold conflicting beliefs or when our actions don't match up with our values.
Oh yeah, we've all been there. It's not a fun feeling.
And street epistemology can actually help us deal with cognitive dissonance in a more constructive way. Well, it can help to lateralize the dissonance by encouraging the person to see how other people have dealt with similar conflicts. You know, like showing them that they're not alone in this.
So if someone's really struggling with their beliefs, you might ask, have you ever met anyone else who holds similar beliefs but has found a way to reconcile this apparent contradiction?
Yeah, exactly. And by seeing how other people have resolved that conflict, it can give them some ideas for how to deal with their own dissonance.
That makes sense. And then how does street epistemology help to verticalize the resolution?
Well, it can help the person to establish criteria for deciding what's the best way to resolve that conflict. Like helping them to figure out what their core values are, and then asking, what criteria would you use to decide what's the most ethical thing to do in this situation?
So you're guiding them to move from a state of confusion to a more reasoned and empowered position.
Exactly. And I think this really highlights how street epistemology can be applied to so many different areas of life.
Mm.
It's not just about changing minds, it's about helping people to think more clearly and to navigate these complex situations in a more thoughtful way.
Yeah, it's really cool to see how street epistemology can be used for so many different things. It's not just about changing people's minds, it's more about improving how we think and how we communicate with each other.
I think that's a really good point.
Yeah.
And, as we've been talking about in this deep dive, epistemology isn't just for examining beliefs, it's also a really powerful tool for guiding both lateral and vertical thinking.
Yeah.
And that's something that we can use in all sorts of situations, whether we're solving problems or making decisions.
So like even if I'm just trying to figure out what to make for dinner, I can use these techniques.
Yeah, exactly. You can start by brainstorming all sorts of different ideas for meals, and then you can narrow it down based on what you have in your fridge or how much time you have to cook.
And I guess the same principle applies to bigger decisions too. Like if I'm thinking about changing careers or moving to a new city, I could use street epistemology to explore all my options and then weigh the pros and cons.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance between being open to new possibilities
Mhm.
and being critical of the information that you're using to make those decisions.
It's really making me think about all the different ways that street epistemology can be used in everyday life.
And I think one of the most powerful applications is in how we deal with conflict, especially in today's world where it seems like everyone's so divided.
Yeah, I mean, wouldn't it be amazing if we could all just listen to each other and try to understand where the other person is coming from?
Well, I think street epistemology can help us do that, by creating that safe space for dialogue and encouraging people to think critically about their own beliefs and the beliefs of others. I think we can start to bridge those divides.
It's like giving people the tools to have more productive and compassionate conversations, even when they're talking about really difficult issues.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's one of the most important things that street epistemology has to offer.
Change your mind, change your life.
Ooh, another good one.
The journey begins at navigatingbeliefs.com.
It's connecting personal growth with examining your beliefs.
Yeah, like if you're not happy with your life, maybe it's time to look at what you believe about the world.
It's a powerful concept.
Well, I've learned so much from this deep dive. It's really given me a whole new perspective on street epistemology and how it can be used to make the world a better place.
I'm so glad to hear that. And I want to thank you for joining us on this journey into the world of street epistemology.
And to our listeners out there, I want to leave you with a final thought. If street epistemology can be so effective in guiding both lateral and vertical thinking, could it be the key to unlocking more constructive and meaningful dialogue in our increasingly polarized world?
That's a really great question, and one that I hope we can all continue to explore together. As we learn more about how to think critically and communicate effectively, I believe we can create a future where we're more understanding, more empathetic, and more willing to work together to solve the challenges that we face.
It's been a real pleasure having you on the show today.
A pleasure was all mine.
And to all of our listeners out there, thanks for tuning in to another deep dive. We'll see you next time.